You've been told a story about why bad things happen to good people in relationships. It goes like this. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time. You couldn't have known. They were charming and skilled, and anyone would have fallen for it. You were a victim of circumstance. That story protects you. It also leaves you exactly as vulnerable as you were before. Because the research on predatory relational patterns, on narcissistic abuse, on coercive control, on the specific behavioral profiles of people who consistently exploit others points towards something that rarely gets said plainly. Predatory people don't choose randomly. They scan, they probe, they select. And the selection process is not based on weakness or stupidity or any deficit in the person being chosen. It is based on the detection of a very specific set of signals that most people broadcast without knowing it, that feel like virtues from the inside, and that read to someone who knows what they're looking for, like an unlocked door. This is what that process actually looks like, not to frighten you, not to assign blame, but because understanding the mechanism precisely, clinically, without flinching, is the only thing that has ever reliably changed it, how the scan works. The first thing to understand is that predatory people are, as a general rule, extraordinarily good at reading people. Not in the way that empathetic people read people, with curiosity, with care, with genuine interest in what the other person is experiencing, but in the way that a system optimized for extraction reads people, with rapid, efficient, almost unconscious assessment of who is available, who is accessible, and who carries the specific combination of qualities that makes them viable. This skill is not incidental to the predatory personality, it is central to it. Because someone who consistently exploits relational dynamics needs to identify viable targets quickly and accurately before investing time and energy in someone who will resist, who will name what's happening, who will exit at the first red flag. The scan happens fast. In some cases, it happens in the first minutes of contact, and it isn't looking for weakness in the conventional sense. It is looking for access. The access signals. There are specific behaviors and qualities that register to someone running this kind of scan as access signals. They are not flaws. Every single one of them is, in a different context, a genuine strength. But in this context, in this scan, they communicate something specific. This person will not make this difficult. Excessive warmth towards strangers. The person who smiles immediately, who works quickly to put others at ease, who seems almost anxious to be liked. This person is broadcasting, at low volume but high clarity, that social approval matters enormously to them. And social approval, the threat of its withdrawal, is one of the primary control mechanisms in predatory relational patterns. You cannot use the fear of disapproval to control someone who isn't afraid of disapproval, but the person who is actively working to be liked, their control mechanism is already installed, the over-explainer. Watch how someone responds when they say no. The person who simply says no and then says nothing else communicates that their no doesn't require external validation to exist. The person who says no and then immediately explains why, apologizes for the inconvenience, offers an alternative, and monitors the other person's reaction to see if they're okay. This person is communicating something entirely different. They are communicating that their no is provisional, that it exists on a foundation of the other person's acceptance of it, and that if the other person pushes back, with hurt, with pressure, with just enough friction, the no has a reasonable probability of becoming a yes. The fixer, the person who, upon detecting that someone is uncomfortable, immediately moves to resolve that discomfort, who takes responsibility for the emotional temperature of the room, who cannot tolerate being the cause of someone else's distress, is broadcasting something that predatory people read with precision, that their guilt is accessible, that the way to manage them is through suffering, not dramatic, overt suffering necessarily. A sigh, a silence, a slight withdrawal of warmth, a look that says, I expected better from you. These micro-expressions in a person wired to fix other people's discomfort function like a remote control. The person who is already explaining themselves, before any accusation has been made, before any criticism has been offered. The person who, in early interactions, is already managing your perception of them, already pre-explaining their choices, already anticipating judgment, already working to ensure that you see them the way they want to be seen, is communicating a high degree of vulnerability to the opinion of others. That vulnerability is extraordinarily useful if you need someone who will work hard to maintain your approval, and will work even harder to regain it when you withdraw it. The first probe. Once a potential target has been identified through the initial scan, the next step is almost always a probe, a small one, almost nothing, designed to answer a single question: what does this person do when something is wrong? It might be a mildly inconsiderate comment delivered casually, a small promise broken without acknowledgement, a boundary mentioned and then quietly ignored, a moment of behavior that is slightly, just slightly, off. Not enough to be obviously wrong, enough to register. And what the probe is testing is the response. Does this person say something? Do they name what just happened? Do they hold the discomfort of introducing friction into a new relationship? Of being the one who points out the thing, who risks being seen as oversensitive or difficult or not worth the trouble? Or do they smooth it over? Do they let it go? Do they laugh it off, or tell themselves it was nothing, or decide that bringing it up would be making too big a deal of something small? The person who says something, calmly, clearly, without drama, communicates that they have a functional detection system and that they're willing to use it even at early stages. That communication tends to end the selection process. Not always, but consistently enough to matter. The person who lets it go communicates something else, that their detection system is present but not connected to their behavior, that there is a gap, a useful gap, between what they notice and what they act on, and the existence of that gap is, for someone running this process, the green light. Why kind people are disproportionately chosen. This is the part of the conversation that most needs to be said plainly, because it is the part that is most often misunderstood. Kind people are not chosen because they're naive. They're not chosen because they're easy to fool. They're chosen because the specific qualities that constitute genuine kindness, empathy, the instinct toward generosity, the discomfort with conflict, the impulse to assume the best of people, the willingness to prioritize others, are precisely the qualities that predatory relational patterns require to function. The pattern needs someone who will absorb responsibility. Kind people absorb responsibility. The pattern needs someone who will provide regulation. Kind people regulate others. The pattern needs someone who will prioritize the relationship survival over their own clarity. Kind people prioritize the relationship. The pattern needs someone who will keep trying, keep giving, keep finding the explanation that makes the behavior acceptable. Kind people try. Kind people give. Kind people look for explanations. This is not a condemnation of kindness. It is an accurate description of why kindness, in the absence of strong limits and clear self-regard, makes someone vulnerable to a specific kind of selection. The role of past wounds. There is one more element of the selection process that doesn't get discussed often enough, because it requires a degree of honesty about personal history that many people find uncomfortable. Predatory people are extraordinarily good at detecting unhealed wounds, not through supernatural perception, through behavioral reading. The person who lights up at a particular kind of attention, who becomes slightly more animated, slightly more open, slightly more available, when someone expresses admiration or interest or the particular quality of being truly seen, is broadcasting the location of a wound. This is what I didn't get enough of. This is what I've been looking for. If you offer this, I will move toward you. The specific wound varies. For some people, it's admiration, the feeling of being exceptional, of being the most interesting person in someone's world. For some, it's rescue, the feeling of being saved, of someone arriving who finally understands the difficulty of what you've been carrying. For some, it's intensity, the feeling, after a long period of ordinary connection, that something real is finally happening. For some, it's simply being chosen, the specific relief of someone who has spent years questioning their own value, finally encountering someone who seems to have no doubt about it. Whatever the wound, the access point is the same. Offer what the wound needs. Watch them move toward you, then control the supply. What the selection process cannot survive. The selection process, this entire architecture of scanning, probing, and gaining access, is disrupted by one thing. Not suspicion, not guardedness, not the performance of having no needs and no wounds and nothing that can be used. It is disrupted by the connected detection system, the person who notices the first small thing and says something about it. The person who, when the probe arrives, when the small inconsiderate comment is made, when the limit is quietly ignored, when the micro behavior registers as slightly off, does not smooth it over. Who says simply, "That didn't feel okay to me." Not with drama, not with accusation, not with a long explanation, just a clean, simple statement that something was noticed and that it matters. That response, that small, early, undramatic correction, is the single most effective disruption to the selection process that exists, because it communicates in one gesture everything the initial scan was trying to disprove. I am paying attention. I name what I see, and I am not available to absorb what I shouldn't absorb. Most predatory patterns do not survive contact with that response. They move on, efficiently, to someone who doesn't respond that way. The question underneath: there is a harder version of this conversation that most people are reluctant to enter. If this pattern has appeared more than once, if you look back across your relational history and see the same selection having happened with different people across different contexts, the question worth asking is not, why do these people keep finding me? It is, what am I consistently signaling that makes me consistently findable? Not as self-blame, as investigation, because the signals that make someone selectable are almost always the same signals that connect to something earlier. A family system that required management, a caregiver whose emotional state needed to be tended, a childhood environment in which keeping the peace was not just preferable but necessary. Those signals were functional once. They were survival strategies, formed in an environment that required them. The work is not to condemn them, the work is to notice them, to become aware, specifically, practically in real situations, of the moments when they activate, when the instinct to smooth things over kicks in, when the discomfort of being disliked becomes loud enough to override the clearer signal, when the probe arrives and the familiar accommodation begins, and to practice in those moments a different response, not a performance, not a strategy, just a simple, clean, quietly revolutionary act of saying what is true. So here's the question worth sitting with. Think about the last time someone entered your life with a particular intensity, with a tension that felt like finally being seen, with a pace that moved faster than your history together warranted. Think about the first small thing, the first moment when something registered, barely, fleetingly, as slightly off. What did you do with that moment? Did you name it? Did you let it go? Did you tell yourself you were being too sensitive, that you were looking for problems, that this was exactly the kind of overthinking that had kept you from good things before? Because that moment, that first small thing, was not accidental. It was a question. And the answer you gave determined, more than almost anything that followed, what kind of relationship became possible. The selection doesn't change when you learn to recognize predatory people more accurately. It changes when you learn to answer that first question differently. And that answer, clear, calm, given once without apology, is where everything begins.